welcome to the STEM Learning question and answer session for the behaviour management online course that we're running at the moment. It's a real pleasure for us to have such an esteemed behaviour expert as yourself here. So one of the things that a couple of the participants have been talking about are whole school approaches to behaviour. And we've got particularly Adam, was what whole school strategies would you recommend for someone setting up a new behaviour system within a school? And we've got Chris explaining how you balance the whole school approach and routines in your classroom so you've got your own personality. So sort of linked questions about whole school. I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, honestly, I think this goes to the heart of what makes a school effective in terms of behaviour. I mean, I've looked at a lot of classrooms. I think there's a high level of consistency between what very effective teachers do. But really, what the biggest lever in a school is the leadership of the school, because they create what I repeatedly call the culture of the school. And if you're setting up a new system in a school, in a sense, that's a gift. I mean, what a great opportunity to try to really make an impact, because a lot of people inherit cultures that have already been existing. And try to steer them slightly. If you can set a new system up, I think the main things that people need to be doing in that situation is, first of all, they need to ask themselves, and this sounds a bit philosophical, but it's really important, is what do I mean by good behaviour? Yeah, they have to be really clear in their own heads, what behaviour am I looking for? Or perhaps another side question could be, what kind of values and culture am I trying to create? What kind of school do I want to see? And you've got to be really clear about that. It's very easy to be woolly and think to yourself, well, I want people to behave well. But that means a million different things. And also, people will have very different ideas about it. And that's the problem, is that students and staff will have very different ideas about what good behaviour means. You'll end up with some teachers who think that it's okay to be 5 minutes late. Some teachers think it's okay to be 10 minutes late or no minutes late. And you need to try and think of some way of systematizing that throughout the school. So first of all, you've got to ask yourself, what values do I want? What behaviours do I want to see routinely expressed throughout the school? And that needs to be quite concrete. You need to really reify that. So ask yourself, what does good behaviour mean in the dinner queue? Walking along a corridor, going on a school trip? What does good behaviour mean to me at the start and the end of a lesson? Ask yourself, do I want all lessons to start the same way, or do I want teachers to invent their own starts to lessons? Do I want lessons to transition internally or externally between lessons, and so on? What do I want behaviour like to be in the playground? And once you've really defined that closely and perhaps written down a few, no, we mustn't see these types of things, and we really want to see these types of things, that's when you have to roll out to your key members of staff, first of all. And once you've rolled it out to them, you train the staff in these procedures. Because one of the biggest mistakes that schools make at a whole school level is they assume that teachers will just know how to do this, which is a bit like telling somebody who can't drive, just drive the car. Teachers need to know in a reasonably sequential order what they need to do in order to achieve the types of behaviour you want to see. So teach the teachers how to begin their lessons, how to end the lessons, how to manage corridor behaviour, what type of behaviour you want to see in the playground, and so on and so on and so on, so that they all know that there's a common standard. And that doesn't mean that all schools have to follow the same standards and routines. Schools can be very, very different. The question is, what do you want to see systematically expressed throughout the whole school? And once the staff are trained, then the students can be taught and trained in it. And I think that's really, really important. I think the message I keep saying again and again and again to people is that behaviour, is a curriculum. Behaviour isn't just something you can assume people know how to do. Behaviour is complex. Behaviour is habits. Behaviour is also knowing things. In many ways, behaviour is like any other part of the academic curriculum. It's something that needs to be taught, needs to be instructed, it needs to be revisited, it needs to be revised, it needs to be mentioned all the time, and that's how you learn to get better at something. So those are that's the kind of global approach I would take. To address the second question that you proposed there, the tension that exists between whole school approaches and the personalised approaches of the classroom. I think that there is a tension here, and I think it's very useful to try to untease it. But there needn't be a tension, and it goes like this. once you've got whole school approaches, once you've got red lines, non-negotiables that everybody needs to follow, adults and staff, adults and students. So, for instance, you want everybody to walk on the left. You want lateness to the lesson to be within 2 minutes of the bell, or whatever it is you've said. You want the lessons to proceed in a certain way. Once you've got that, then really it's like the old maxim that everything that is not forbidden is permitted. You can give teachers then space to personalize their lessons and to have their own style. For example, the standards and procedures and routines of a drama lesson might be very different to a mathematics lesson, and so on. And that's fine. And you want people to have that scope and that leeway. But when there are non-negotiables, they must be non-negotiable. So it's kind of like, people often say to me, how much detail do we need to go into as a school? How deeply do we have to drill into micromanaging the behaviour of staff and students? And again, to me, it just depends on the type of school you want to have. I mean, I've seen some schools where they really micromanage behaviour down to, the blink rate of the students and so on. And, that's fine if you're getting the results that you want to achieve, if you think that it's working for you. And I've seen some schools where it's very laid back and laissez-faire and liberal and high fives and cuddles. And again, that's fine too. It depends what you're trying to achieve. But if something's a red line, then it's a red line and it can't be negotiated in the same way that, every community has non-negotiables, like murder and burglary and so on. And you don't say, but is that too draconian? There are some things, some rules you need to follow in order to be an effective community. There are some areas that you can have a bit more leeway, and it's up to the leadership to work out where those 2 points lie in the spectrum with their staff.
And I'd agree with that totally, Tom, but I also think as well that if you have got those particular classroom-based red lines of your own, and particularly thinking in a practical classroom for a science lesson, for example, you also need the senior leadership to be aware of those additional red lines that might be subject-specific and to be able to support you on those as well. So I think it's a bit of a two-way thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly, I agree with that level of personalisation, undoubtedly. I mean, one of the reasons why you sometimes see different behavioural practices between people like design technology teachers or people that run Duke of Edinburgh trips or science teachers that run lots of practicals is that for them, behaviour is non-negotiable because student safety is at stake. People can get seriously hurt. And what you frequently see in science classes is science teachers teaching children how to behave around Bunsen burners and whatnot. And Duke of Edinburgh trip organisers, if you don't listen to their instructions, you can fall off a cliff. So these people really take it seriously and put it to the forefront of their instruction. And what I'd like to see all teachers and leaders do is think, right, okay, so all behaviour is important. So it's important that we teach the children to do it. But of course, you would want some very subject-specific instructions too.
Yeah, that's great. We've also had a question from Farouk, who's interested in your thoughts on ways of discouraging various forms of bullying that's not overt, but it's things like the silent treatment, cyberbullying, those types of things.
Right, that's a good one. It's quite a subtle one because it's funny. There's always this tension in behaviours, in conversations about behaviour. Some people think that trying to direct the behaviour of students is draconian and oppressive, and other people, want to try to micromanage students rolling their eyes at each other. And again, I don't have a strong opinion on either because I think it just depends on the type of school you want to have. We all know, for instance, that in peer groups and in small communities of children, but also adults, that being ignored and being cut off is one of the most unpleasant experiences you can have. And to some people, it can be as traumatizing and unpleasant as more active forms of bullying and name calling and teasing or even physical assaults and so on. If I'm honest, it's very hard for adults, particularly people who aren't in that peer group, to notice every single little micro gesture that people express. You'll often find out after weeks and weeks and weeks that somebody's been cut out of a group, but you might not have noticed it yourself because perhaps understandably your business is trying to teach mathematics or English or whatever. So one of the most effective techniques in that respect is to try to be proactive about teaching behaviour. And again, this is something that we saw with the most effective classrooms in schools, which is that frequently teachers in schools have got what I would call a very reactive model of behaviour management. They wait for something to go wrong and then they punish or reward the pupil accordingly. I'm not against that approach. I think it's part of the approach we need to have. You must have sanctions and rewards in any school system. But the schools that were really effective were good at that, but far more importantly, they were really good at teaching good behaviours. This is why I say that behaviour should be almost seen and addressed as a curriculum to be taught explicitly. And I do mean explicitly, and revisited and revised and so on. So, for instance, at the beginning of your relationship with children, whether that be at the reception class or year 7 or whatever you start with them, you need to teach them what civility means, what good conduct means, what being kind to one another means, what being diligent, what persevering means, and so on. All these lovely character skills that we wish everybody had, and so on, can essentially be expressed as behaviours or habits. I think habits is a better way to describe it. Yeah. So you want to teach children what kind of habits you want them to have. Now, these can be academic habits, like how you structure an essay, how you conduct yourself in a debate, and so on. But just as importantly, and I do mean just as importantly, you also teach them the habits of being members of a community, members of a group, and so on, and what that normally means. And there's a wonderful bit in the old Paul Hogan film, which many of your viewers will not remember, called Crocodile Dundee, where he plays this kind of Australian outbacker, or whatever, I'm not sure what the phrase is, and he comes from this very, very rural place in Australia, and he comes to New York, and he's amazed by how many people there are. He turns to his friend and he says, "My God, how many people are here?" His friend says 9 million, and he goes, "Wow, they must all be really friendly." And there's this kind of, the joke is, of course, that New York in the 80s wasn't meant to be very friendly, which it is now. But there's truth there, which is that when you coexist in a community, you need to develop lots and lots of little micro behaviours of how to rub along with each other in a nice way. But those behaviours have to be taught. They cannot be expected. And a lot of children will come to the classroom, perhaps not having had a lot of explicit instruction into how you get along in close quarters with people. So it's not just about group work, it's also about saying please and thank you and holding doors open and being nice to somebody and not disrespecting them if they get a question wrong. And you need to explicitly teach that, and that includes things like bullying. This is how we treat people, and give them little demonstrations and model it yourself and mention it all the time and call them out when they're not doing it. So if it looks like somebody's being bullied or left out, you just say, "Oi, we're not having that. This is how we treat each other in the class." And you make an issue of it. I don't mean necessarily a big public demonstration, but you speak to people at appropriate times about it. And that way people see what's normal and what's not normal. And that's a really strong way of suppressing things like bullying and being ostracized and so on. It's not an easy process. It's a long, arduous process, but this is why we get paid the big bucks.
And I think that the other thing that I also think around that is that that's got to be shared as one of those values or behaviours with the teaching staff in terms of their training as well. That we're not only training about sort of calling out or shouting out, it's about how to treat each other kindly in the classroom.
I just add one more quick thing, and it's more specifically related to bullying, which is this, that very few people see themselves as the bully. We are all the protagonists in a self-penned melodrama. We're the heroes of our own stories. And frequently when you call somebody out on bullying, they'll say, "Oh, I wasn't bullying him. They deserved it. They were being rude to me. They were cheeky." And so, and we frequently find that, of course, bullying is very often a very complicated circumstance situation. Often it's not. Often it's very one-on-one, and there's a clear victim and a clear oppressor, and so on. But to really get adults to think about bullying, you have to get them to think about their own conduct too. And you just have to look at social media to see people who consider themselves to be very, very nice people, and they very frequently put, "I believe in love and justice" in their bios. And they're vile to one another online, and because nobody thinks that they're bad. Everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing, and that if they're being bad to people, it's because they deserved it. And that's something which adults need to confront as well, I think.
I absolutely agree with you, particularly around that, because I think that it's too easy, especially on social media, to fire an unthought out response to something that people jump on the back of, whereas you wouldn't actually go and say that to somebody's face. You wouldn't stand in a football stadium with it written on a placard so that people attribute it to you. And so actually it's about teaching the young people and the adults that actually this is a public forum. You wouldn't be standing and shouting about it in that way in the shopping centre, because you personally would look foolish. So think carefully before you start shouting about something on social media.
Yeah, I know this may sound, this is controversial to some people, but I would really stand by this. Unless you've got a very specific reason to use it, I don't see a lot of value in having smartphones on the premises, or at least available to students. I think if you want to curb cyberbullying, one of the best things you can do for them is to give them a safe space from smartphones between 9 and 3, or something like that. Because then that's when they start to access it. And most police liaison officers I speak to spend an enormous amount of time now dealing with the fallout of cyberbullying, which is extraordinary. That was just something that didn't happen systematically 10 years ago. I'll leave mobile phones alone.
Yes. So we've also had some comments on the activity, which is about what is your harshest punishment. So we've had Oliver asking for your views, and I thought also Taithoi was talking about the different types of sanctions and whether they were fair. If you were not doing your homework, throwing rubbish, or being late for school, getting the same punishment of cleaning out the yard or cleaning up around the school. So there's this, what's the harshest punishment question, and what are your thoughts on that? The thought about if there's consistency around the punishment, i.e. you get the same punishment for any misdemeanour. Is that what, as Melvin thinks, a primitive approach? I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for that. The question, what is the harshest punishment? I know that, I don't know if it's still the case, but I know that in Poland, if you had three demerits in a year, you could be held back a year.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get a demerit for being late or not doing a piece of homework. Now, that's a fairly harsh punishment. Having said that, the ones that are still available, people often talk about exclusions and so on. I'm not sure exclusion is a punishment. I think it's more of a kind of consequence of an action. But in general, I try to adhere to a few simple maxims, which is, number one of which is that the certainty of a sanction is far more important than the severity. The certainty is, it's an old saw in education, but it needs to be repeated more and more until people get the habit of it. And we know from plenty of psychological studies that sanctions tend to work best in what you would call a very high trust environment, when people know it's going to happen, when it's very, very certain. That's when the deterrent effect starts to kick in. And that when people think it's not as likely to happen, a bit like a speed camera that you think might be off, it has a very mild deterrent effect, which means you'll be doing the same deterrents over and over again to for diminishing returns. So I do believe in sanctions. I think they're an important part of your behaviour repertoire. But what they do, but then you have to revisit, what are sanctions for? And essentially they're to deter. There appears to be a kind of a mistaken expectation in education. Nobody will say this explicitly. There appears to be an assumption that if you've got a very highly sanctions-based system, that there's just the right sanction for each crime, and that will somehow amend the behaviour, or justice will be served to some extent. And I used to get this a lot when I was writing the TES online behaviour forum. People would say, what sanction should people get if they do this or this or this, as if I was supposed to create some kind of algorithm for the sanctions. And a lot of schools can tie themselves in knots and make it far, far too complicated as to what sanction they do not. Sanctions are there to deter. And the curious thing about sanctions is once you've incurred a sanction, it obviously hasn't deterred you. So a lot of people go, well, that didn't work, so we should stop doing sanctions. And and nothing can be further from the truth, because the sanction isn't so much there for the person who's incurred the sanction. The sanction is there to maintain the norms of the community, to deter everyone else. And everyone else needs to see that the sanctions happen for that deterrent effect to even occur. And if you take away the sanctions, and if somebody routinely incurs sanctions and it doesn't seem to amend their behaviour, the mistake many schools will do is, we shouldn't have sanctions because it just doesn't work. take them away and see what happens. And what then happens is people think, well, there's no consequences to my actions. And people who wouldn't normally misbehave think, well, why not misbehave if I feel like it? Because we're quite egotistical. So certainty is very, very important, which doesn't mean you don't have the exceptions. You can have exceptions. You must have exceptions. I mean, in general, in society, it's frowned upon to murder people, I gather, I'm told. But, there are exceptions. There are loopholes to that, self-defense, acts of war, and so on and so, intolerable cruelty. I don't know, but, there are various things that judges can take into account when you're either sentencing or whatever. And so schools should do that too, particularly for children with special educational needs, particularly for things that children can't help and so on. There needs to be exceptional exceptions, which are logical, consistent, and fair. So we get that too.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And I also think that young people also need to realise that there are some young people in the community that don't necessarily have the same sanctions as everybody else because of the challenges in their life that they may be having at that time. I think it's reasonable to express that to the other young people, because they will say, but it's not fair, X has done this and they got that sanction. And I think that being open about that is really helpful to have those norms and that behaviours, that not everybody is the same.
Yeah, I mean, to take a really obvious example, and I use this all the time, if a child's got Tourette's and they've got uncontrollable verbal and physical tics or mannerisms, you don't give them detention for swearing, because that would be ridiculous. And the other kids get that. They go, okay, fair enough, he's got Tourette's. And it very quickly just becomes part of the background. If something's a bit more sensitive, something's a bit more to do with disclosures or child protection, so on, you don't want to be too open in the class, you can still say to the class, we are dealing with something here, and we are dealing with it. There's things here we can't tell you, and we just need you to cooperate with us. And most kids go, all right, okay, fair enough, something's going on. Because most of those kids will either have been through or gone through, or know somebody who's gone through some dreadful circumstance in their life. And in actual fact, most of the kids probably know what's going on in their friends' lives anyway. So it's, there's like a bit of a game you can play, but kids do appreciate that. What they don't like is, he just got off with that. Why didn't he get in trouble? Why could he just shout out and swear and so on? And that's when that needs to be addressed. And the second question, which your correspondent said, which was, the same sanction for lots of different types of misdemeanors and so on. You must have an escalating tariff of sanctions. I see a lot of schools and say, if you break any rule, you've got an hour's detention. Any rule at all. If you're late by 1 minute, an hour's detention for everything. It kind of reminds me of an old Star Trek episode. They went to a planet where there was lots of peace and civility. Everybody was really kind to one another, but there was only one penalty, which was death. So if you littered, you were executed. If you murdered, you were executed. So no wonder they had good behaviour. That doesn't make sense, because it's crucially it's just unfair. If somebody giggles in class or breaks wind too often, it's probably not as bad as bullying or punching somebody in the face. And people need to understand that for something to be just, for something to be fair, people have to get what they deserve rather than what they don't deserve. So that's a basic principle of justice. And secondly, you have to remember that sanctions are there to deter. So it's okay to have a similar simple sanction, like a detention of 15 minutes or 20 minutes or half an hour or whatever, for a variety of different offences. So being a little bit cheeky in the lesson, being deliberately late, getting your phone out, whatever, that might all be half an hour detention as a mild deterrent to remind people not to do these things. I've got no problem with that, because as I say, the sanction doesn't need to be complicated, fancy, or ironic, because that's not the effect it's having. A deterrent must deter. It must be something that people don't want to incur, which means it has to be mildly unpleasant. And by that, I don't mean contravening the Geneva Convention guaranteed rights. I just mean, sitting in a room for half an hour when they don't want to be there. Something like that. I don't think that's particularly cruel. And I think it's a good way of reinforcing the norms of the community.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think the particular lunchtime sanctions around, picking up litter if you've thrown litter with a high-vis yellow jacket on, so that other people can see that you're doing that. Yeah. That's also a visible sort of deterrent to everybody else.
I've got no issue with that, really. Honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think a bit of community service is a useful thing for people to see. And I think people should be doing, incidentally, I also think people should be doing the high-vis litter picking anyway. The kids should be doing that as part of their Duke of Edinburgh Awards or whatever, so that people see it's not just a shameful thing, that it's, it's a positive thing, it's contributing back to the community.
I think that I agree with that, and that's great. Okay, now the next section of questions I've got is about parents and how they manage their children's behaviour. So we've got Tracy, who's got some homework expectations in her school, which are very simple: reading once a day with an adult, practicing times table and practicing spellings. And she's wanting to help. There's a lack of enthusiasm from the parents to motivate their children to do those activities. And I was wondering how she could motivate them to be, parents particularly, to become more engaged with that.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? Who watches the Watchmen? I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is managing our own behaviour. A bigger challenge than that is managing children's behaviour, and an even bigger challenge is then managing the parents' behaviour. Because your locus of influence gets less and less. The further out from your own body you go, the less influence you tend to have. And if you're fortunate in the demographic circumstances of your children in your school are ones of good fortune, of lots of social capital, lots of cultural capital, and so on. And typically you'll see this in lots of well-heeled areas. Parents really value education. They see it as being transformative and so on. Obviously, this isn't exclusively to well-heeled areas, but it's just demographically there's a high correlation. Then your job is much easier. If you're dealing with a parent who's time poor, or who may have different values to the ones you would hope for, who doesn't value education as much, and would rather just plonk the children in front of a television or whatever. And that can be middle class, upper class, working class, that can be anybody. If you're dealing with a parent like that, that's a real challenge, because those values are crucial. Because those values then become the child's values very easily. And those values then map onto behaviours. So a child that doesn't value education, a child who's told, why are you reading that book? You don't need to do your homework, just shut up and go to bed, just shut up and watch your television or whatever. Will come into school with very different behaviours, obviously, because they'll absorb them from home. So this is a complex one. And one of the things I always remember, the words of Professor Daniel Willingham in this, when he said at a conference I saw him at in New York, he said that whenever you're trying to persuade somebody of something, you're not just trying to convince them up here, you're trying to convince them in here. You have to persuade people's hearts. It's the whole hearts and minds analogy. And people who are good at rhetoric, and people like Aristotle have been writing about this, many years ago. The fact that if you want to win an argument, you want to persuade somebody, you don't just give them the information. You give them a reason to believe. You give them a reason to care about the information. So, what is it that you both care about? What is it that adults and that the parent and the teacher probably cares about? The child, the well-being of the student. So when you talk to an adult, one of the things you don't do is you don't alienate them. You don't criticise their parenting. You don't say you're a bad person. You don't say your child is bad either. What you say is your child can do better. Your child has got so much. It's got so much potential. And that's the kind of thing that parents kind of go, yes, I agree. Yes, my child is valuable. I do care. And let's face it, most parents do care about their children. In fact, most parents care far more about the child than we ever will, because it's their child, not our child. And there is probably a fractional percentage of parents who are just pretty lousy, and that's a different challenge. But for the most part, for most parents, you can say to them, look, this homework's important. They need to do this because they'll get better and they'll find school much more enjoyable, and they'll have much more fun, and they'll get that really strong satisfaction of being at school and being good at something. And I need your help. Because what they need to do is they need to see that you think it's important too. And I know we've all got pressure on our time, and I totally respect that. But just what I say, and I say this to all the parents: make sure that that homework time is important time. And you know what? Actually, you can make it a really good time to spend some time with your kid. It shouldn't be seen as a punishment on both of you. It should be seen as a nice chance for you to talk about stuff. That kind of attitude normally gets you quite far with a parent. Secondly, what I sometimes find with parents is that sometimes they themselves are a bit worried about doing the homework. They're worried about not being able to answer it, particularly with, kind of mathematics, but literacy. It's something that perplexes a lot of people. And, I speak as somebody who is reasonably literate and numerate. I've been through university. I get involved in a lot of educational research about teacher training and so on. And then when I was sat down with my own children doing number bonds, I suddenly realised that I didn't actually know how to teach this stuff. That, I was much better at the secondary level than I was at the early years in the junior level. And I had to go and read about it. And when I spoke to teachers, a lot of teachers themselves were a wee bit unsure. They just kind of gave them number bonds and maybe gave them an abacus, but it was all about just, hoping they would kind of learn it by themselves. Think how most parents feel. They need to know how to do good phonics instruction. They need to know how to do number bonds. They need to know how to do times tables and so on. They need to know, for instance, that some of it can just be repetition, repetition, repetition. Some of it needs to be explanation. Some of it needs to be, right, let's demonstrate using beads, sugar cubes, or whatever. Simple techniques. And once you've taught parents these, sorry, this is a hell of a long answer, but what I find with behaviour, adult and children's behaviour, is that very frequently the reluctance to change their behaviour isn't because they don't want to change their behaviour, it's they don't know how to change their behaviour, particularly when it comes to teaching. And let's face it, we find teaching hard. So why shouldn't parents find teaching hard when it comes to first principles and axioms and basic steps?
And so that really clearly links to the previous question about whole school strategy. You've got to teach the adults first before you can support the child. And this is the same goes for the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we forget that at our peril. There's this assumption, and it's an assumption which permeates education, that teachers come out of training ready. That head teachers or school leaders, when they achieve position, already know what to do. That students come to schools classroom ready, and that parents are somehow born to be parents and know how to parent. And anyone that's ever been a child or a teacher or a parent knows this is not the case, and that you need somebody to instruct you, you need mentors, you need help. Otherwise you'll invent the wheel, you'll reinvent the wheel, and you'll probably do it badly or suboptimally, shall we say.
Great. I've got a few questions about whole class approaches, handling whole class behaviour situations. We've got Rosie, who's talking about how do you handle unresponsiveness from a whole class, which Gillian has replied to, and she finds this as well, that quite often you focus on individual behaviour management, but how do you talk about whole class? And we've also got Anita here, who's got her class who's very unmotivated, even when she's planning games that are fun, and they're just really disengaged as a whole class. Are there any ways in which you could support those questions around how do you manage large numbers of students in a class, either being disengaged, not really unmotivated, and not really engaging in the learning?
Yeah, great question. First of all, this goes back to my original premise, which is that we mustn't just react to misbehaviour, because then we end up just putting out individual fires. One child does this, so we respond to that child. One child does this, so we respond to that child. You'll spend your whole life doing that, and they probably won't amend their behaviour too much. So what children need is they need to be taught appropriate habits of conduct at a whole classroom level. And actually, in fact, that's far more effective. So you need to start your relationship with saying, this is what I expect from you all. This is how we're all going to get along. This is how we're all going to learn. This is how you're all going to flourish and do really, really well. And I believe in you, and I can't wait to teach you, but we're all going to have to do this, and this is why. So you sell it. As I say, you use a bit of rhetoric. You try to engage them at a values level, at a belief level, as well as just a this is what you must do level. So that's the main approach, the way you deal with a whole class. Another thing is you talk about your subject like it really, really matters. You talk about it like it's important. And very frequently I find in some schools we treat some subjects as more important than others. And I'm always interested in the fact that most children in secondary school at least will acknowledge that maths is important. Now, don't get me wrong, maths is incredibly important. But what I think is astonishing that it's normally taken from the school. They normally pick up off the school that the school thinks maths is really important because they get they themselves get graded on it. So whatever subject you teach, treat it like it's important and just say, I'm really looking forward to teaching this. Talk about it with the same level of enthusiasm that you have for the reason that you took the subject. So that's another thing, treat it like it's important. Lastly, when it comes to the demotivated class, you've got to remember, you cannot make people feel things. You cannot make people love your subject. It's impossible. Or what you can do as a professional is you can try to teach it well so that it's intelligible. You can make sure that people have mastered the basics before they move on, that they've got the fundamentals before they move on to more complex matters. Otherwise, they'll never enjoy it because they'll always feel like a failure. And every student needs to taste success in the classroom somehow, which means at whatever level they're at in your subject, they need to feel some kind of sense of affirmation that, I may not be a brilliant French speaker, but I did well for my ability. I learned 3 more verbs today. I conjugated them well. I used them properly in a sentence. And yeah, the person next to me might be speaking university level French, but that's okay because I am where I am and I'm getting better at it. And the teacher tells me this and they tell me how to proceed to the next step, which is basically just good pedagogy. That itself will be very, very motivating because the satisfaction of doing a subject well is quite addictive. And many students who don't get a lot of value in their life, a lot of meaning in their life from school will find it in other places, peer groups, hanging out in gangs and so on. And if you can turn a kid on so that they get peer recognition and a sense of being valued and meaning in their lives in your classroom, that will help to create that kind of level of engagement that everyone's looking for. What you don't do is try to create artificial synthetic engagement by having whizzy games. Because what you're doing then is saying that the games are more important than the learning, that you're trying to sneak in the learning underneath a spoonful of sugar. But that's suggestive of the fact that learning is the nasty medicine. No, learning is the good stuff. Learning is the good stuff. And being good at something is the good stuff. And yeah, sure, you can leaven the pace and the type of activity in your classroom, because we also know that in order to achieve maximum levels of focus, you have to have a variation of routine and pattern and pace and so on. Otherwise, it's like you can be the best speaker in the world, but people get bored of you. You got to do different things, different types of activities. So we know that too. But what we don't do is just have an endless range of, Britain's Got Talent tasks. It used to be blockbusters when I was a teacher, but that's no longer the case. That's also quite fancy. So there's that. Also, sorry, just one last thing. I'm on a roll. I would suggest that if you try to see demotivation not so much as a state that they're in, but as a behaviour they're exhibiting, you can make low output. You can reclassify that as being misbehaviour. So if somebody doesn't do very much in the classroom, I have absolutely no qualms whatsoever with saying, that's interesting, I'll see you at 3:00 when you can finish it off then with me. And then, students very quickly do the maths and go, I better do it first time. But they'll do what you let them get away with. There's a lovely line, what you permit, you promote. And if you allow them to do 3 questions when they should have done 10, they'll do 3. They'll do 3 next time because you've reinforced that expectation. But if you say to them, 3 questions, that's interesting, not good enough, I'll see you at 3:00, and you can do the other 7. They'll do it once and go, this person's a hard ass. They expect a lot of me. But in a way, high expectations are also quite motivating because it shows that you care about them, you believe in them. I know you can do better. So that's the way, there's no magic trick, and it's laborious and it's long-winded, but that's the way you get to students.
I just wanted to pick up on your idea that you were saying about some senior leaders have more focus on some aspects of the curriculum, because that, I think, is being sort of focused upon in the new Ofsted framework around the curriculum intent, implementation and impact, and how that you can't have a one-size-fits-all curriculum. It has to address the needs of the students, and it can be different for different contexts. And it shouldn't necessarily all be an academic focus. Do you think that's a good focus for the Ofsted framework to be having now?
I think that it's, if I can tease apart some of those things, I think that every school should expect every child to be exposed to and have the benefit of the same kind of well-rounded curriculum that every child gets. What I don't like seeing is this attitude where by year 8 or year 9, we condemn some children by saying, oh, well, they're not very academic. Let's give them more, well, it used to be called metalwork when I was a kid, but, let's give them more stuff with their hands. And I know that's very well-meaning, but the end result is we think they're a bit thick and they'll never be able to learn. So there's that. There absolutely is that we do need to make sure that we're not giving up on children and saying, actually, no, we do believe that you can achieve certain levels of literacy and knowledge of the world and scientific understanding and so on. At the same time, you also have to acknowledge that you cannot just put through every child through the same curriculum and expect the same outcome. If you do any work with alternative provision or special schools, you'll find that, if a child is functionally illiterate at the age of 14, you don't put them through GCSE English. You put them through phonics or something similar. So you can't have that one size fits all. You have to understand where they're coming from, what their baseline is, and so on. So I do certainly agree with that because the new Ofsted framework, as far as I understand it, makes a strong case for, we still expect that every child should be succeeding in some level. And it also makes a case for the fact that every school should be offering a well-rounded, balanced curriculum, including lots of extracurricular activities up to what the budgets can afford. So I think those are two very important emphases, and I think they are slightly different, and they can sometimes be in tension, but I think they are still very important.
Great, thank you. So we've talked about whole classes. One of the questions that Andrew, who works in an FE college, was talking about the fact that he has to move classrooms. Quite often. He's not got a dedicated classroom. I think that's not just an FE problem. That can be, you might be working in a multi-site school, or you might be a part-time worker and you don't work in the same classroom. Quite often in those situations, you're sometimes playing catch up with the class. Either they've arrived before you. How do you go about managing that situation?
Yeah, that's nothing. To be honest, I spent about 10 years in a school. Working in those kind of circumstances. I went to a school where you had your own classroom. It was an extraordinary experience, because all of a sudden you've got a space which you inhabit where the norms are kind of known, and when people walk into your room, it's very much your room with your expectations and so on. So when you're in that circumstance where you're portable and your lessons are portable, I mentioned before about the importance of teaching children norms and routines. If you're in a circumstance where the norm is that you get there second after them, the norm is that you're in different rooms, then you have to then teach them coping mechanisms and coping habits to deal with those norms. So, for example, you might want to teach them a very close system of routines for what they should do while they're waiting for you, which means you have to think ahead and think, well, how can I make sure they've got something to do? Maybe it's work that I set at the end of the previous lesson. Maybe it's something to do with the homework. Maybe it's some kind of task. Maybe there was something on the board. Maybe I can email them something. It depends on your circumstances. But there needs to be a routine, an expectation, a norm of what they should be doing in those circumstances, which you then can follow up on, but something which can be demonstrated immediately as soon as you walk into the classroom. You can see they've done it or they haven't done it, in which case if they have done it, then you can work with them on it. And if they haven't done it, then you have some kind of consequence system. Even in an FE college, you still need to have some kind of form of consequence system. It might just be a collegiate chat, or it might be something to do with phoning home or whatever. But there still needs to be some kind of behavioural feedback on that wasn't good enough. I need to see a bit more, because if you just spent the first 5 minutes of the lesson doing nothing, then that's problematic. But when they walk into your room, even if it's the janitor's cupboard, if it's your room, they need to feel like it's your room, or the communal room that they do the activities that you set.
Yeah, great, thank you. Sometimes Olivia asks a really interesting question. Sometimes she really recognises and values talking to students privately around the consequences of their behaviour, but sometimes she feels that you're in a situation where you have somebody who's disrupting and you have to deal with it immediately. So how do you get the balance right between minimising the public shaming, as she calls it, of the student, but also taking back control of the classroom so that the other students aren't negatively affected? Yeah,
I think that, no teacher, no student should be subject to indignity. They shouldn't be humiliated in any sense. That's just a basic axiom of civil conduct between people, of whatever rank or status. Everybody should be treated as though they have dignity and they're important. And somebody once said to me that that's what manners are. Good manners means treating somebody like they're important, whether you think it or not. And I think that's very, very true. But it means you have to model it yourself, which means you have to be dignified and reasonably respectful. Having said that, if somebody is making it harder to teach, if someone's if someone's impeding their own learning or the learning of others about them, if somebody is impeding the dignity of other people, perhaps by being cruel or mean or disrespectful to them, then it behooves the teacher to be the finger of justice in that circumstance, which means calling someone out on their behaviour. Now, it's reasonably easy to develop a way of speaking to people that calls them out on their behaviour, but it isn't necessarily abusive. I mean, you don't have to humiliate somebody for misbehaving. You just have to mention them that's inappropriate behaviour, and whatever the feedback is, whatever the consequence system your school has, then administer it there and then. So it might be something like, I need you to wait outside for 2 minutes because I need to talk to you. Just calmly, just please leave the classroom, please. Or it could be something like just a very mild reprimand, like, come on, I settle in there, what should you be doing? Or it could be a little bit more in their face, like, you're very close to getting a C1 or a C2, whatever it is. You say it calmly, say it as kindly as you like, but mean it. And I think it's that meaning it which gives your directions, your commands, integrity, and it gives them gravity. You can say something with a smile on your face, but you have to mean it. And I think a lot of people forget that. And because we're often not very good at giving directions and not very good at giving instructions, we become quite emotional about it, and we become, I'm going to have to tell them off now. Right, that's enough. I've had it from you. Because you think that compensates for the feeling of insecurity you feel in yourself about what if they don't listen to me, what if they don't agree with me. You don't need that. You just need to be sincere about what you say. That's not good enough. You need to stop doing that just now, or this will happen. That's much better. Thank you very much. And acknowledge it. And
it's about having that confidence to be the adult in the room.
Yeah.
I'm the person who's managing behaviour in this classroom. I think in some ways, in a science lab or in a PE lesson or in another practical subject, you have sometimes situations where you do see something that's not safe going on, and you immediately have to stop the class to say, we've had this issue over here. Somebody might have broken a beaker or something, might be glass everywhere. And so you need to have that command and take control of the classroom to say, something untoward's happened here. Just stop for a moment, sit down, we'll sort it out, and then we'll carry on. And that's having the confidence as an individual to take control of a situation. You don't have to be nasty. You just have to take control.
Yeah. I mean, in that context, you're absolutely right. Being nasty would be counterproductive anyway, because I've seen very, very nice students being incredibly turned off by a teacher who's just obviously a bit mean. It's reasonably rare. Most teachers, of course, just want the best for their children, but a lot of them sometimes think, right, I'm not sure if they're going to do what I'm going to ask them to do, so I'm going to be really, really intense with them. And the kids just go, God, what an ass that person is. And they don't respond to it. And there's a lovely line, professional warmth. Professional warmth is a great way to go with it. You speak to somebody like you're ordering something over the phone. I need you to leave the classroom just now. John, I just asked you to leave. Can you leave the classroom now, please? Thank you very much. We'll talk about it in a minute. Thank you. You've slightly dislocated yourself there, because you're not getting all like, John, get out of the classroom, or please leave the classroom. It's, John, I need you to leave. And it's that sincerity which really communicates gravity, and students pick up on it. Because they find it very hard to do themselves. Most students are kind of waiting to be instructed to some extent, I think. They're waiting for an adult to come along and say, you should be doing this or you should be doing that. They're relieved by it, I think.
That's great. Now, you've sort of started on some individuals, and we've got a sort of couple of questions around individuals. One from Maria, which she works in a private school. She's dealing with disruptive 13-year-olds who are very disrespectful towards the teachers and the learning environment. It must be quite a challenge to work in a private school with quite privileged young people and to have that sort of situation. I don't know if you've come across this before.
Yeah, it's funny because I've worked with a lot of people in the independent sector. And yes, by and large, the behaviour tends to be much, much better, simply because you tend to have children who come from demographics where there's there's normally much higher levels of social capital and social instruction and so on. I say normally, like I say, there's no causal factor here. But also I've worked in a lot of independent schools where there's a lot of misbehaviour too. Now, it tends to be a lot more to do with kind of insolence and disrespect, much more low-level stuff, but that can be equally a kryptonite to your lesson. In those kind of circumstances, I think what you tend to be facing are confident children, children who feel like, oh, I'm more clever than the teacher, or who's this new person who, they don't have the right to tell me what to do. I've been in some private schools, for example, where I was at a very, very prominent international private school a few months ago, where it's, it was tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds for each year. And I saw a student there who literally had never been told no by their parents. They just couldn't understand. Why are you telling me no? And they would throw a tantrum anytime someone said they couldn't do something. But then, to be honest, I've seen that in homes with very low income as well. That sometimes children get everything that they want at a different level. In those circumstances, the answer is normally just the same. They need to be taught how to behave, which means that teachers in an independent sector environment mustn't walk in and just assume the children know how to behave. The children still need to know that you know what you expect of them. So you need to walk in and say, hi, I'm Mr. Bennett, or whatever your name is. I'm looking forward to teaching you. This is what we're going to do this year. We're going to do some brilliant things. This is how we're going to achieve it. These are the basic rules of the classroom, and I really need to see this happen. And if we do this, we're all going to rub along really well together, and we're all going to achieve and flourish. And most kids are like, yeah, that sounds pretty sensible. And if you've got a kid with lots of social capital, they'll probably all fall into line a bit quicker and go, yeah, that makes sense. We'll just do that. But if you've got kids who don't, who lack those kind of norms or habits, you're going to have to work on them. So really, it doesn't matter what their income is. It just depends on where their baseline behaviours are and what you need to do to take them further than that. Whatever you do, don't assume they know how to behave.
I think that's really interesting because we've had a question from Jacob, who's talked about getting your class back on track at the end of the year, as it were. Right. And we're at this particular stage of the year where people are thinking about, how am I going to manage with my new timetable, either starting now or starting in September, my new classes. I think that it's very useful and valuable to spend time as you get to know your new classes and your new or resetting the agenda at the beginning of the year when you're coming through to that. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, one of the things I keep going back to this idea of behaviour as a curriculum which must be taught. Now, normally your basics will be taught at the start of your relationship. But then constantly throughout the rest of the relationship, you need to revisit those basics. And again, it's like the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. We forget stuff really quickly. And that includes behaviour habits. And also, as good habits start to slide, erode and dissolve, they become bad habits. And because they tend to happen reasonably slowly, nobody notices it happening. So what teachers need to really invest in is every so on, is to revisit those behavioural expectations very explicitly. And it might be weekly, it might be monthly, it might be, biannually, whatever. But there should be some level of revisiting, some kind of retrieval practice going on when it comes to good behaviour, which also means that you are also thinking about it yourself. So there's that aspect. It also needs to be threaded constantly through the relationship, through every single conversation. Those expectations you set on day one must be constantly revisited and reminded. Just everyday conversations, You're late. What did we say about homework? What's the expectation when it comes to letting other people speak? Just mention these things all the time so that it becomes embedded and normalized into the conversation. When it comes to rebooting, though, rebooting tends to only need to happen if things have slid a little bit. If things haven't gone the way you've wanted. And again, that can happen for lots of good reasons. You might be drowning in misbehaviors. I try to use the analogy of a diet. So let's say January the 1st, you say, that's it, no more mince pies for me. And you start losing weight. For a month, you're doing really well. And you go to the gym every day. And then, of course, February, everything dissolves and it's back in the Mars bars. And rightly so. Now, at the end of February, you might look at your waistline and think to yourself, oh, God, that didn't go so well. What happened? And you could do what a lot of teachers and a lot of school leaders do and say, that didn't work. It'll never work. We'll never manage to do this. Or February the 1st or March the 1st, you could say to yourself, right, let's start again. It's the only way you proceed. Okay, I didn't do what I wanted to do there. Let's try again. Let's think about, is there something I need to do to make it easier for myself? Maybe don't work in a sweet shop, or whatever. But you need to say to the children, right, guys, We've done okay since the start of the year, but to be honest, the behaviour is not where it needs to be for us all to do really well. So let's go back to what I said at the start of the year. This is what we need to do. I just, put the books down, put the pens down, talk to them about it, maybe have a conversation about it, ask them what they think about the behaviour and the effect it's having on them. But let them know that you still think it's important, because a lot of children think, well, if the teacher isn't mentioning it, then it's probably not important anymore. And what you permit, you promote. So reboot. And you can reboot, and this is the brilliant thing about it, you can reboot at any time. You can start your diet again at any time. You don't have to think, oh, well, I'll need to wait till September. I have to wait till the next January. No. People don't have time to waste. Kids don't have time to waste. Walk into the classroom the next day and say, this is what we need to do. Let's reboot. We need to get back to square one. But you have to mean it. And you have to, and this is another good line I always remember, make monitoring your routines part of your routine. So write in your planner, next Monday, check everyone's got their equipment, check the uniform, or whatever it is that you're focusing on. Just write down the word punctuality in your planner. So if anybody's late on that day, then you make an issue of it. You remind yourself to make an issue of certain things, or not finishing their work, or not putting their hand up, or whatever. But remind yourself what it is that you think is important, and then nag them to death about it.
I think it's really funny, because I remember I have a very particular routine of young people entering the laboratory and where they put the coats and the bags, and I remember really hammering it into them when I had the year 7s when they first started. It was a real big focus, this routine of entering the classroom. Yeah. To be ready to work. And I think once you establish yourself in a school and you've been there a few years, what you'll see happen is what happened to me is I hadn't taught that class of students again to year 10. So 3 years later, I then had that class, and they came in and did that routine. Wow. Because I'd hammered it into them so long in the year 7, but they had that expectation of you. This is the way you behave in Miss Knowles' classroom, and so it automatically they rebooted that for themselves.
That's great.
Which is fantastic. So I've got a series of questions from non-teaching staff.
Oh, yeah.
So Magdalena, Yvonne and Victoria. One of them's a cover supervisor. One of them's a librarian in a college, and another one is an after-school club volunteer. And they're asking support on how they can manage the routines in those situations. And is it better to sort of like talk to teachers and use their routines, or establish their own routines in there?
That's a really good point. I mean, there's some quite different roles there as well. So a cover supervisor will be moving into a teacher environment. They are the teacher. Now, I know that, legally and financially, they're not treated the same, and I get that. But in schools where cover supervisors are very effective, you tend to find that there's a really good whole school culture. That I remember once going into a school where I walked into a lesson and the behaviour was great. And I said to the teacher, how long have you been in the school? And she said 25 minutes, because she was a cover supervisor. And she was, or a supply teacher, which is obviously slightly different. And the students knew that this is how they behaved in school, so they behaved. And she had to do very little. But what she did have to do was she had to know what the school systems were. So she was given a half an hour induction before she even stepped foot in the classroom, which was ideal. That's obviously not going to be everywhere. And very frequently you'll go into suboptimal circumstances where the school isn't particularly perfect and the children are challenging. So from a cover supervisor or a supply teacher's point of view, you need to know what the school systems are. You need to know a few key names. You need to know somebody nearby that you can call them for assistance and their name, and you have to secure their offer of help. You have to have, at the very least, a basic parking and removal process in place for children who make your lesson impossible. Those 4 or 5 things, so that the students can see very quickly that you are part of the school. And you have to also talk about the lesson like it's a real lesson. If you walk in and say, there's the work that's been given to me, do it or don't do it, or if you communicate that by just sitting at your desk and then ignoring them, then then you're condemning the children to do the work if they're well-behaved children, and not doing the work if they don't want to do it, which isn't really what the job is. Your job is to supervise, not just make sure they're not killing themselves, but supervise a lesson, which means that, if you're a cover supervisor, and very good ones do this, they will say, right, this needs to be done. If you have any questions, do ask me. Obviously, I'm not a specialist, but I'll do my best. And I expect to see some effort. And I guess that's all you can really ask them is for effort. Maybe pair them up with people who can help them. For example, try to get a seat plan if there one exists. So borrow the authority of the school because you're part of the school. And if you've been a cover supervisor for a while, you should know the school procedures very well after a while, but you must use them. And if you feel like the school isn't backing you up, then you insist upon it. And so a lot of managing upwards needs to happen. And I know a lot of cover supervisors have a really hard time because they're not treated as being proper teachers, and the school doesn't treat them like proper teachers either. And that's dysfunctional. That's very unhealthy. If you're a librarian, it's kind of like you're a supercharged teacher in some sense. I mean, it's my room, my rules. You don't just a classroom. You've got a library. You've got a space which is yours. It's one of the most important spaces in the school, I think, which means that you have to have norms for that environment. And I would suggest that it is taught at a whole school level somehow, either by doing classroom visits or doing something in an assembly, but really setting up saying, this is a library. It's an amazing place. It's a dream factory. Come on in, jump in. The water's lovely. Libraries are campfires. Come and get warm. But you got to make sure that they do understand that, because very frequently it's just seen as a place to bunk, or it's a place where naughty kids get sent. Yeah, I've seen that happen. Wait and sit in the library for half an hour. Oh, great, thanks. No, it's not like that. So there needs to be norms and rules. But the librarian needs to know that they will be backed up by senior members of staff, which means there needs to be communication with senior members of staff. These 3 kids ran in here bunking and then ripped up a book. And very frequently you'll get, I'll deal with it later. No, that's just as important as misbehaviour in any classroom. In fact, probably more so to some extent. And what was the other one?
Volunteer. So a volunteer who's working in an after-school club. But it's interesting because she sort of said that it's normally great, the behaviour, but in some situations there's a teaching assistant who reinforces a negative, though fond perception of one student as a charming troublemaker. I'm not a member of staff, so I'm really not comfortable with having a quiet word with the TA. Is there anything else I can do? I think that's a very interesting question.
Okay, that's a tricky one, because, to be honest, if you're going to be an adult in an adult professional environment, you have to be prepared to have adult conversations. And I know that's hard. And I'm certainly not standing in judgment here, because it's incredibly hard to have accountability conversations or these kind of professional conversations if you're not used to them, if you don't know these people and so on. I really wish it was the kind of thing that we were trained in, either in teacher training or leadership training, because it's crucial. And many leaders aren't very good at these conversations either. Would rather do anything than have a firm word with somebody. But a firm word you need to have, otherwise, life will walk over us. If the TA is doing something which you think is counterproductive, then have a conversation with them. There might be good reasons why they're doing it. They may very well know more about that student's circumstances and so on, that maybe they are helping without you knowing it. But you need to have that conversation to find out. And crucially, if they are doing something which you find is undermining you, then you need to let them know. And there's no such thing as a charming troublemaker.
No.
Or rather, they can be charming, but they're making trouble, and that's not charming.
Lovable rogue.
Lovable rogue, and that, there's a lot of sin covered by that phrase. If you're running an after-school club, I'm guessing in most circumstances that it's not compulsory for the child to be there. If they're making it impossible for you to run that club, if they're making it difficult for other people, if they're just disrespecting you, if they're treating you without dignity, then you should have the ability to say, you can't come back to this. But of course, before you get to that nuclear option, you need to have conversations with, listen, I really want you here, but this way you're behaving just now is causing problems and this is the behaviour I want you to do. So youth workers or people that run clubs or volunteers and so on, they still need to know that they're the adult in the room, and they still need to have a normative conversation at the beginning of the relationship. Hi, I'm really looking forward to doing this activity, whatever it is, but here's how we're going to make it work for everyone. And I need you to do this. And if you can't do this, then you can't be here. but I hope we don't get to that stage because I want you here, and blah blah blah, positive, positive, positive. So they still need to have that conversation, and if you're not prepared to have those types of conversation, then it will always be difficult.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I've got a few questions about practical lessons, which I've touched a bit on practical lessons, but I've got one from Ashley who is struggling when she's planning fun maths lessons involving games. I would call that active learning myself. So, overexcited students, and movement around the room if you're not used to it, like for example in a maths lesson. Saroja has also talked about hands-on activities and students leaving a total mess. How do you control them? And Aina, how do I make all students participate actively in my physics class? And I think that it goes very much back to, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is having those additional routines in terms of the practical activities. And so when I've been training teachers around how to set up and manage the practical space, as it were, you have to ensure that your resources are available and organised for the students, or the students have a routine for doing that. So you have a person who's assigned to get the Bunsen burners, and a person assigned to get the beakers, and have them positioned around a room so that there's not chaos in there. You have to plan time to not only reflect on the learning and understand the purpose of the practical activity, because if it's not purposeful, it's just following a recipe on a sheet, or there's no meaning behind it, then they will find it really difficult. It's just a fun activity rather than actually it's part of their learning, and these are the outcomes from their learning that they need. But also you have to plan in tidy up time, either halfway through the session or at the end of the session. It's always very handy if the session is going up to a break time or a lunch time, and so you are able to then say, well, the room isn't tidy to this level of degree that I want, we'll just stay until it's tidy. But planning in a certain level of time to do the tidying up and allocating people to that within there, or that they're a team, you're a table, you're a team, you've all got to be involved in this, and teaching those sorts of behaviours very early and managing those routines throughout. I think I learned how to do this when very early on in my teaching career, when I had done practical work at the end of the day, I hadn't set a routine, and I ended up tidying up the room myself for over an hour. And I thought, I'm not going to do this again. And so you actually have to make sure that in any practical activity, whether it's using equipment, cutting things out, etc., that or doing a full-scale practical with sixth form A-level chemists, that in that routine, that they have a routine to do that tidying up. And we don't want to rely on support staff or the teachers to do that. And sometimes it's really important because somebody else might be coming into the room after you. So I think that, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't disagree with anything you said there. I think it all comes down to all behaviour needs to be taught.
Absolutely.
And some people are better at it than others, and some people will get it quicker than others. But by and large, I mean, knowing how to conduct a practical in science, that's a natural thing. I mean, people aren't born knowing this. And you might have done a bit of it in primary school. You might know, or you might have been told by your mum and dad, make sure you clean up your mess after you whenever you make a mess. I mean, some people will have these habits, but a lot of them won't. If you just say we're going to do practical, and all of a sudden you've got, molten gauze everywhere, endothermic chemicals over everyone's faces. Don't be surprised if you haven't taught them about safety and instructions and cleaning. The real boring stuff.
Yeah. And I think it's also really important that teachers or newly qualified teachers are actually also taught how to do that as well. It's really important that laboratory routine is sort of managed in that way. So good behaviour is far too vague and broad a term. Good behaviour is a million different subroutines of behaviours which then comprise good behaviour, and children need to be taught that. And the individual little subroutines, like how to put a test tube away, how to clean a test tube,
is dull. But that's what comprises it. You know, it's like learning how to drive a car. I mean, there's no one part of driving a car which is exciting or cool. You know, how to use a clutch, how to use a gear stick. I mean, you know, it's not exciting, but driving a car can be really pleasant and sometimes fun, you know. And I equate this. I think there's a big mistake we sometimes make when it comes to active learning and trying to engage children in learning and so on. As I've said before, I'm not against, you know, more fun activities. I think it's a very useful way to leaven the pace and so on, which actually maintains and maximizes focus. But I think that trying to engage children with a subject by making it pleasant isn't always the right way to go, and you know, we can sometimes fall into a chasm of gimmicks and so on, which, you know, the spoonful of sugar technique I mentioned before. I mean, if you talk about a game of football, what's the most fun part of the game of football? It's normally scoring a goal or saving a goal. You know, one of those, you know, that's probably the two big highs: the glory, the status, the achievement, the accolade, and so on. And what you could do then is you could try to teach football simply by having penalty shootouts. But you wouldn't be teaching people how to play football. And what you would be doing then is you would be over-focusing on one thing to the detriment of everything else. So I think when it comes to lessons, is that you try to make lessons satisfying. You know, you have to get something out of it, but it might not always be fun. So that's what I think.
I was just going to ask you one more question before we finished. One of the things on the new Ofsted framework is the separation of the behaviour as a judgment. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I think it's pretty wise, and to be honest, I've kind of campaigned for them to do so. So I can't really go against my own preferences here. I think it's useful because I think that behaviour needs to be looked at in isolation. I think that for too long it was seen as largely a byproduct of good pedagogy, which is well meant but just utterly wrong. The idea that if somehow you could just get just the right type of lesson, if you could plan your lessons just so, then people's behaviour would naturally emerge in response to this beautifully planned lesson. I think it's based on a very outdated concept of human nature as being intrinsically good. This idea that children are naturally curious and naturally want to learn. You know, and my response to that is, you know, have you ever met any? I mean, they are sometimes, but, you know, we're asking them to do stuff they don't want to do frequently. They don't want to learn stuff. So I think there will be times we need to direct and amend in response to their behaviour. So I like the fact that it's now been separated out. It's been seen as something specific, something important. I think that by doing so, it magnifies the status of it, something that schools need to look at and be aware of, rather than just something that they try to suppress on the day of an Ofsted inspection. I like the fact that it mentions high expectations, which is a bit of an obvious thing to say, but it's something that needs to be seen. I mean, high expectations needs to be reified and made concrete. How does a school demonstrate high expectations? Are all children viewed as being capable of succeeding, or are some written off? You know, I remember in the bad old days when we had the CD borderline students. You know, do you remember those days?
Oh, yeah.
Because they were so important to our school's 5A star to C ratio, that these children were disproportionately important, and people at the top and the bottom were less so. I mean, to see, you know, do schools avoid that? Do they view all children as being important? It also needs to talk about things like learners' attitudes. So, you know, do they care about learning? Do they think learning is important? Have they been taught how to behave? Have they been taught the values and norms of the school? And I also like the fact of respectful relationships. But if incidents do occur, and they will, how does the school respond to them? And I think that's a really important thing for Ofsted to look at, because you'll go to a school where you won't see any misbehaviour. So you might think, oh, behaviour is great here. Or you might go to a school where you see one fight. You think, well, the behaviour here must be terrible. But no, not necessarily. I mean, things do happen. How does the school respond? Particularly if you're dealing with children who already display more challenging habits and behaviours. So I think, in essence, I think it's a very positive thing for Ofsted to be doing. Time will tell if it has the consequences that we hope it does. And the law of unintended consequences is something we always have to be aware of. But, you know, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would also say is this links very much back to your behaviour curriculum, and I think I very much buy into that way that not only young people need to be supported to have the right attitudes and behaviours, but teachers have to be supported and trained to help them to have the right attitudes and behaviours within the classroom, and raising the profile of behaviour hopefully will raise the profile of the support and training that is available for teachers to do that. And on that note, I'd really like to thank you very much for being here. We hope that our online behaviour management for STEM teachers is really helping to fill that learning gap for teachers. We've been running it for a very long time now, and many teachers come back and dip back in again, and so that's really useful to see. We always run the Behaviour for Learning at the end of September for teachers who might have gone back to school and thought, I really need some help to reboot behaviour in my classroom, or particularly for NQT teachers. Yeah. To be supported during their induction with something that's free and available online for them to access, either individually or in groups or as part of their ongoing training. So we really value your input into this, Tom.
It's all an honour, really is. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And I'm sure that you'll have a great time over the summer, and I'll be looking forward to working with you again in the future.
Good, and good luck to the listeners. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Take care.